Well, you're watching Beyond Markets. I'm Onyi Sunday. On today's show, we will delve into the migration crisis in Africa, as well as the recent urban development agenda. You can join the conversation using the hashtag Beyond Markets or follow my handle at Onyi Sunday. Now, crisis is a bad time to make policies, and while it may create space for reform, the current quick fix quest that the United Nations is pursuing in reaction to accelerating migration trends risks creating more long-term hazards than solutions. Now, this is according to Loren, Landau, Director, African Center for Migration and Society. He joins me to discuss his views on the United Nations Declaration and Migration and the more recent urban development agenda. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Loren.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm going to start off, of course, with your view. You just said crisis is a bad time to make policies. Care to tell us why?
Well, I think if we're talking about migration specifically, we know that migration, whether it's from rural areas to cities, whether it's across borders, whether it's across continents, is a mark of our age. That's how the economy works. The economy needs labor. People need to move, to access resources, to access jobs. But Europe is now in crisis. The United States is fearful, and they're pushing a global agenda around migration, which is really about trying to control people's movements, not to facilitate it, not to make it part of everyday life. And the fear, and what I think we're starting to see from Europe, is a clampdown, a sense of saying, look, we don't want any more. People are a threat, whether it's because of their color, their race, because of their religion. We can only take a few. And the result is we're going to have policies which stop people from moving, whether it's domestically or internationally. We're going to have aid to Africa to try to absorb refugees rather than letting them go to Europe. And this is going to create whole underground economies full of corruption, full of exploitation, and it's not going to help people with their livelihoods. And ironically, it's going to stop Europe from getting the labor that it needs.
So what do you suggest should be the best approach at this point in time?
Well, I think we need to have an approach which is very much focused on realism, on recognizing that migration and people's movements is necessary for families to get out of poverty, for labor markets to work and have the flexibility that they need, for companies to get the skills that they require. And instead of those sorts of factors informing policies, what's forming policies is fear over Islamization, fear over cultural change, fear that communities and people are going to be displaced by newcomers. And I think we have to find a way of shifting that discussion. That's hard. Those are tough political issues. Immigration has been a tough political issue for decades. But I think it's time within a sort of UN framework, within national frameworks, whether it's the African Union or the European Union, that we have a discussion that is more moderate and more informed by fact rather than fear.
So just tell us more about this new urban migration policy. Let's begin to understand that right now. You did mention earlier about encouraging the trend. What I'm confused now is it encouraging the trend or is it trying to curb the trend?
Well, I think there's two processes that have been going on. So a few weeks ago, the UN had what they called a kind of humanitarian summit, which was to deal with the refugee crisis and really, I think, to deal with Europe's refugee crisis. There was a meeting in Quito, in Ecuador, around the new urban agenda. Those discussions have not been talking to each other. There's been one recognizing that we are in an urban age, and if we're talking about Africa, we're going over that 50% urban for the first time ever. And there's a recognition that this is where the future of the economy is. And a lot of that growth is from people having children, from people living longer. But part of cities is also that it's a place where people go. And the new urban agenda is saying, look, everyone should have a right to the city. We need to govern cities so that they can absorb new people, that they can provide services, that they can provide opportunities for people, because this is the fastest way out of poverty, it's the fastest way to grow business. But yet, that agenda has also not adequately considered what it means to have people who have lives in multiple places, rural and urban, or in multiple cities. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to change that and realize, look, people don't stay put anymore. That's not how we live.
While we try to, ensure that these countries absorb most of these migrants, can we also consider the situation these countries face? You also did mention earlier that countries are also talking about the fact that they want to clamp down on the trend, judging by the fact that security issues, you said it might be as a result of race or security, reasons differ. Are we taking into consideration the economic situation in most of these countries and probably maybe their inability to accommodate these migrants and give them a better life?
Right. I mean, I think these are very real issues, but we have to also keep these numbers in perspective. I mean, if we're looking at migration within Africa, for example, the vast majority of people who move are moving within their own country, whether it's from a rural area to a city or a town, or from one town to another. And so those people are citizens, those people have rights, and governments still don't want them. I mean, local governments often very hostile to people from other areas, maybe because they speak a different language, maybe because they're not part of the political party that's governing that city. But then there is the question of international migration. And if you're a country like Lebanon, where you have 18% of your population has become refugees, mainly from Syria, or you're a country like Kenya, which has had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of refugees from Congo, from Sudan, from Somalia, from the DRC, there are real issues there about how we cope with that population. But the response of keeping those people out and securitizing the border or keeping them in heavily controlled camps means that they're going to live like that. You're not going to capitalize on the opportunities that migration has. And all you're going to do is create economies of violence. You're going to create economies of exploitation. So I think we have to look at how do we facilitate this movement? How do we do it in a way that's humane, but also can help the economy of these countries? I mean, a country like South Africa has become extremely hostile in many instances to immigrants, and we hear exactly the kind of language or the words that we can't take them. We have massive joblessness. We have a lot of violence and insecurity here. All of those things are true, but about only 3% of South Africa's population, 3 to 4%, is foreign-born. And a lot of those are highly skilled professionals who can help create jobs. So again, we have to look at each country or each community in its instance and say, look, what is possible here? What would be required to move forward and treat these people in a humane way, but do it in a way that can also benefit us?
All right, now let's shift. Let's discuss more about migrants, of course, outside the African continent. Since you're focusing on migrants within the African continent, most of these African countries, my question is, are they really better off? Because in as much as we try to sound very diplomatic with the issue, I say to I just want to put myself in their shoes and say, they're dealing with their own economic problems. You cannot give what you do not have. Mm.
Well, I mean, I think...
How do we balance this?
Yeah, I mean, clearly having hundreds of thousands of people move into your community, or 1 million people, is going to be a challenge. In 1994, Tanzania had 250,000 people a day coming out of Rwanda. That's not something any country can cope with, whether you're Germany or whether you're Tanzania. But that's not the norm, and most of the time what we're seeing is people moving more or less gradually, more or less predictably, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's to escape climate change, whether it's to escape conflict. And yeah, these are things that are going to be hard for countries to do, but a regional approach which says, look, we're going to grant these people rights, and a regional approach which says we're going to support communities that need support is a way in which everyone can win. Huge amounts of money are spent on managing the refugee camps in Kenya. Huge amounts have been spent on managing camps elsewhere. If that money rather went to community development and said, look, take these refugees, we'll build you a new hospital. Take these refugees, we'll improve your sanitation system. Then everyone wins. The refugees have a place to go, and the communities have systems that they need.
Well, of course, that's another. Are we referring to countries outside the African continent pledging to support these countries that would accept these refugees, or are we talking about countries where the refugees are coming out from?
Well, I mean, I think with the countries where the refugees are leaving, there's very little that we can do from outside. I mean, these are countries that are often at war, there's conflicts. The best we can do is through the UN or through regional mechanisms try to resolve some of the conflicts. But we also have to recognize that people are going to continue to move. If you're Central African Republic, if you are Syria, the economy of those countries cannot absorb the labor that's there. Those people are going to move whether there's peace or not. Zimbabwe is going to take a long time to reconstruct, if we even get to the point of reconstruction. So we need to think about what are the countries around that, within Africa, outside of Africa, going to do. And I think there we need a reasoned approach that's not, again, based on fear, but is based on, can we take these people? Can we put them to use? Can they grow our communities? Can they grow our economies?
You know, why I actually ask that question is when you take into consideration, of course, regional cooperation. I ask myself, how well do most of these countries within a particular region interact with each other? The last Ebola crisis, I would say, they opened up that window for better interaction where you had health workers leaving Nigeria to go help most of these countries. But then it took a while. And so I ask, how well do they really incorporate, you know, in order to absorb these people? Is that something they're going to have to keep on, is that something they're going to have to start working on now? Or how easy do you think it's going to be?
Well, it definitely will not be easy, but we can take inspiration from the area where you are. So, sure, economic cooperation, social cooperation, political cooperation has never been what we'd like. But if we look within ECOWAS, there is a facilitated movement or free movement protocol, which allows people, more or less, to move within the region with many fewer obstacles than they would face elsewhere. The East African community has put forward a similar policy, which would allow people to move from Kenya to Tanzania or from Rwanda into Kenya. It's not been fully implemented, but I think we're seeing signs of progress. And more recently, the African Union has said they want to facilitate a sort of free movement within the continent. That's not going to be easy. They haven't made huge progress on that, or indeed on many other things. But I think we're starting to see a recognition that the kind of strict border controls, the kind of idea that we can build a national economy that's disconnected from our neighbors, that we can solve any problems in ways that are disconnected from our neighbors, is starting to fade, at least among some quarters. So I think that there's hope for this. But again, I think we need to move past the kind of nationalism, the kind of fear, and say, look, where is our economy going? How can we grow together? What are our common interests here? And as you said, if Ebola made it very clear, disease does not stop at the border, and so does the same holds for many social and economic processes. They're no longer just something that we can manage in one place, and migration is another one of those issues.
Interesting. Well, Loren, we're going to be talking more about this after the break. I've been speaking with Loren Landau, Director, African Center for Migration and Society. The rest of the discussion continues after the break. Just stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching Beyond Markets as we continue our discussion on migration crisis in Africa, as well as the recent urban development agenda. My guest remains Loren Landau, Director, African Center for Migration and Society. Thank you so much for staying with us, Loren. Well, just before we get back to the issue we're talking about earlier on, now you argue that a quick fix for strategy focused on Syrian refugees might not augur well for migrants who fall outside the 1951 Refugee Convention. Care to talk us through this?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a kind of doubling down of saying, look, we signed these documents, we signed a convention which says that refugees who meet particular criteria have to be allowed into our countries. What they're going to say is, look, if we're going to let these people in, we're going to make sure that we're going to keep everyone else out. And so, okay, many of the Syrians might qualify as refugees, but many of the people coming from Africa to Europe or traveling within Europe are of kind of what we might call mixed migration flows. If we take people coming out of Zimbabwe, for example, there's not a war going on right there, but the situation is so desperate that many can't afford or can't stay and hope to have a livelihood. Same with Central African Republic, parts of Chad. They may not be in a war, and so they will not qualify as refugees, but they're going to be held in place. And I think the danger here is that we're going to find a solution that's driven by what do we do to provide refugees some sort of support and find ways of stopping everyone else. And my fear is the vast majority of people who are moving are not refugees, and they're going to suffer as a result.
Well, I was watching a video a few minutes ago, and it's it just sends shivers down your spine when you look at the migrant situation in Africa. Alone. I mean, because of course right now on the news the focus has been on the refugees from Syria and other Middle East, Eastern countries. And then you look at what's happening in Africa and you're asking yourself, where's the crisis coming from? Just like you said, there are lots of reasons why people are moving. What is the UN saying on that issue at the moment? Or do you think the Syrian refugee situation has just topped discussions?
Well, I think within the United Nations, at least at the global level, what's happened in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, of course, when there's a sort of earthquake or disaster in Haiti, as we've seen in the last few weeks, those are the issues that are on the agenda. That's what people are fearful. And most of the donors who support refugee-related relief are in Europe or in the United States, and so they help set that agenda. I think what's happening within Africa is quite sad in the sense that there's very little attention to refugee issues here. And that we're starting to see a greater hostility in many places. Kenya has threatened to close its camp and send people back to Somalia, a country that we know is not stable, is not peaceful. We're starting to see efforts from many states to close the borders. And the UN has been largely quiet on this, or in some cases has endorsed it. And I think what we need to see is a sort of working together within the African Union mechanisms or within the regional economic cooperation mechanisms to say, look, this is not going to take us anywhere. Yes, we have fear of terrorism, we have fear of insecurity, economic threats, but we need to find solutions that are reasonable and humane. And the UN, I would hope, along with the African Union and others, would push that agenda, but right now they're really not.
Where do you think the problem really lies? I'm going to use Nigeria as an example again. We have refugees, or like called internally displaced persons, as a result of the attacks by Boko Haram in Nigeria's northeast region. They are dying daily at these IDP camps. You see pictures of children starving, the mothers starving, and this is within a country, one country to begin with. And, you know, it's not a very positive picture in that area. Now, if one country just cannot handle its own internal crisis, how possible do you think it will be, you know, for other countries to accept those coming from outside? Where do you think the problem really lies? Is it a style of governance? What is it?
Well, I mean, I think you point to that issue, and what your last comment is that this is an issue of governance and it's an issue of politics. We know that conflicts happen within countries in areas that are either politically neglected or politically contested. And so the parts of Nigeria where Boko Haram has run wild are areas where the central government has little interest or has an interest in destabilizing the political powers that be. The same would go for parts of the Congo, where you have hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people who've been internally displaced. And I think we have to recognize that those people are displaced because the government doesn't care about them. And when they move somewhere else, well, the government still doesn't care about them. And so this is where you need sort of international pressure, you need humanitarian organizations, and you need local communities to say, look, this is not what we want. You can't have hundreds of thousands of people of your own citizens, whether it's from a militia, whether it's from Boko Haram, whether it's from government forces themselves, who have been displaced. These people are citizens, they have rights, and they should be supported. But you're absolutely right. The issue is one of politics. And then the question is, how do you shift the political incentives? How do you encourage a Buhari, or how do you encourage a Kabila either to stop instigating the violence or to try to respond in a way that is humane and sustainable?
Now, if the governments don't care, whose responsibility is it now to draw international attention to that cause? Who do you think should push for it?
Well, I think everyone should be pushing for it. I mean, if you're in a community where you've had refugees or internally displaced people move in, obviously they're going to have an effect on you. And what we've seen is some communities will say, look, we're happy to have them. It increases our market, it increases opportunities for trade. But others will say, look, we're under threat and we need help. So that must be the first line of kind of where we see the alert sort of raised. But then we need the organizations, the international organizations, the Amnesties, the Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, of course, to be saying, this is an issue, we want to solve this problem. And for Europe to say, look, if people are going to be displaced within Africa and not going to find peace and security within Africa, they're going to try to come somewhere else, and that's not something that we want. So we'd appeal also to the interests of Europe or other places to say, look, what can we do to try to assist people closer to home so that either they can stay there or return home when the conflict ends?
Now, of course, when these migrants move into countries, of course, they settle in one state or the other. Let's take a look at, of course, the housing crisis in most of these African countries. We do know that most countries haven't even accommodated non-refugees, let me put it, to give them proper housing. Talk more of having to absorb a new number of people. How best do you think we should begin to address this? Do you think it's about time governments begin to include that in their budget in terms of housing, not just for their citizens, but those to come?
Well, I think what we've seen, and we've been doing research on how local governments prepare for changes in their population. And as I mentioned before, most of the change in municipalities' populations are due to the fact that either people are living longer, they're having high fertility rates, so the population is growing, or people are moving in from rural areas where the economy is not so stable, or one of the children needs to go to the city while another one stays behind. Cities are not planning for that. Local government across Africa is not planning for that. And as a result, we have a lack of sanitation, we have a lack of housing, we have a lack of schools and clinics, et cetera, for the population that is there and is naturally growing. You add into that the refugees, and it contributes to the sense of crisis. So my argument is, and still is, is that if we want to prepare for refugees, first let's prepare for our own populations, and then they won't be fighting for the scarce resources.
That's a very interesting way to put it. It's a very interesting way to put it indeed. Because when you look at most of the African countries, you find out that there's usually this massive exodus of people from the rural to the urban areas. The urban areas are already overstretched, you know, with little or no housing units for these people coming in. Meanwhile, the rural areas have land with no construction in them. And I'm saying, when do you think it will dawn on African governments that there is a dire need to develop the rural areas?
Well, I mean, I think we do need, obviously, more equitable development. The economy is such that small-scale farming is no longer viable in many areas. But we shouldn't see it as an either-or. People coming to the cities often do invest in the rural areas, and that's one of the ways in which investment happens, is they come to the city, they get a job, whether it's professional or whether it's in an informal sector, and they're investing, they're supporting people in rural areas. But we also shouldn't fool ourselves. Investment in rural areas, what we've seen in China and other places, actually encourages more people to leave, because you educate your children, and then they don't want to stay farmers anymore. But I think what we will see, and what we're starting to see, is a recognition that we can't just build the economy in one or two cities. It can't just be Lagos and Port Harcourt. It can't just be Johannesburg. It can't just be Nairobi. We need to invest in smaller regional centers so people have somewhere else that they can go if they need to leave the farms. And we're starting to see the fastest growth in Africa, population-wise, is in those smaller towns, at least either as a place where people go to stay or as a place where people go to get the resources they need to make it in the big city. And as we look at planning for the future, it's not just about the giant megalopolises, the ones that are 10 million or above. It's going to be looking at these towns that are 100, 200,000 people. And how do we build those economies? How do we build those services so that people can be closer to home and people can also get the services that they need?
Now, which brings me to the urban development agenda in Quito. Is there a thing or two that you think Africa can pick up from that?
Well, I think people have recognized at a global level that we are in an urban age. This doesn't mean that the rural areas or small towns don't matter. They do. They're connected to these big cities, but that the future is urban. And what we've seen across Africa, because many political leaders have their political support bases in a rural area, often an area where they're from, we haven't invested adequately in the cities. So many of cities across Africa still have basically the colonial infrastructure or infrastructure that was built just after independence, but the population is now 4, 5, sometimes 20 times what it was then. What we're realizing now is that if we want to promote development, we need that infrastructure for business, for service delivery, and that's going to mean massive investment in urban areas. That may be politically hard to swallow for some people, but I think without that, we're going to see massive slumification, we're going to see the threat of disease, the threat of riots, the threat of political unrest. So hopefully the message is coming through. The future is urban. Let's invest in that area. It will need a new way of budgeting. It may very often mean a kind of real decentralization of spending and authority. But without that, I think we're going to be in trouble in the years ahead.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Loren. It's really been very interesting talking to you and getting your perspective on migration crisis in Africa. I've been speaking with Loren Landau, Director, African Center for Migration and Society. And that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, you can stay engaged using the hashtag Beyond Markets or follow my handle @OniSunday. From me and the team, it's bye for now.